again for flexing and being willing to reschedule. Sorry for the hassle behind all
Well,
that.
that's okay. It's
If
important. This
I'm,
is important. This is an important issue. I'm willing to make it work.
I think people are pumped that you guys are having a conversation. I think you guys haven't met in person, have you, before, as far as I'm aware?
No, we've never met in person.
Okay. Okay. Well, this will be as close, second best to being physically in person.
Although, sometimes I
Uh,
have met people in person and just didn't remember them either. So I've had that happen.
well, that's certainly understandable. That happens probably to both of us because we have somewhat of a public ministry. People, I mean, I remember I had Dale Allison on last week, and I met him once 15 years ago. And he's like, "We've never met, right?" I was like, "Well, I said hi 15 years ago. There's no reason you would remember me." All right, here's Titus. Titus, hey, buddy.
Hey, how you doing?
Awesome. I'm doing well. Thanks. David just joined, so I've got both of you. I think this is the first time you guys have officially met, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah. Thanks for joining us, and thanks both of you guys for being willing to change the date. Stuff was just out of my control, and I couldn't do it.
Are
It's
you
okay.
recently married? Did I understand?
No, but part of it is that with it's immigration issues. She's having trouble with the embassy, so
Okay. Gotcha. Okay.
Uh,
Fair enough. We don't have to go down that road. Um, Super pumped to have both you guys here. I've been looking forward to this for a long time. As you both know, I've had Titus, you're on this show, given 15th century date. David, although this is your first time, had your buddy Michael Jones to give kind of a popular level version of 13th century date. So my viewers have listened to both, and both have gotten good responses. So my goal here is really on this channel, I tell people two things: charity and clarity. That's what I'm hoping for. And consistently people do that. I'm confident the two of you will be awesome there. But I just want to moderate this thing. I'll be honest with you, some of the details of this are above my pay grade. I'm not an archaeologist. I'm not an Egyptologist. So I'm just going to do my best to keep the conversation going. Don't want to get too muddled where we'll lose lay folks. That's really our audience: engaged, thoughtful lay folks, apologists. If we get too much in
sure.
the weed, we'll lose them. So, when it's all said and done, this is not a debate. I just want people to walk away and go, okay, I see why people hold this, so hold that. I can decide what I think is most reasonable. So that's the big goal here. Before we do an audio video check, any questions from either of you kind of about what we're doing and what we're aiming for?
Nope.
Nope. Yeah, I think you laid it out pretty clear.
All right, I'm going to do a quick audio check. Both of you look good with video. Check 1, 2, 3, 4. Check. Go ahead, Titus.
Check 1, 2, 3. Check.
David.
Check, check, check. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3.
Okay, I'm gonna. We're not live, which is good, just in case. All right.
Well, if I cough a little, it's because I've had bronchitis all week. I had the flu last week,
Oh,
so.
oh gosh, sorry. That's not fun at all.
Back to
So
normal.
I'm still coughing up a lung a bit. So if I sputter a bit, that's just par for the
Well,
course.
that's that's fine as long as you're alive and doing good.
Everybody
Give me
understands.
a second to hear this back. Okay, good. I'm the one who's slightly low. That's perfect. Let me turn mine up a little bit. There we go. And I think we're ready to rock and roll. Okay, if by any chance we lose one of you, we'll pause, just call back, and depending on where it's at, restart the question, keep going, and I'll edit it later.
Okay.
Okay.
That's it. 10:33. Dear Lord, I'm going to block my phone. So many stinking political texts nonstop here in California. I'm going to work through this list that I both of you kind of got it, and we'll just start. I think it'll make sense to start biblically. Where do we hold? Why? have you go back and forth. At some point, I'll say, all right, you've made your case. Let's keep going. I'm sure we can nuance these to death so people understand. And then we'll move more to the extra biblical stuff. And I think at your suggestion, David, pretty quickly we'll get to the Pharaoh identification and spend a little time talking through that. And then we can get to archaeology, the Exodus cities, Exodus place names, Egyptian toponyms. You came up with this list, Titus, so I might just have you lay out, David come back, and then we'll just go back and forth a few times. But I'll probably navigate the conversation that way just to get it going, if that's fine with you guys.
Yep. Yeah, fine with me.
Does that sound okay? Okay. All right, awesome. Well, let me pray, and then we'll get started. All right. Father, thanks for technology, and we ask you to go before us and clear away any issues we might just encounter. And I pray when it's all said and done that we would advance your kingdom in this conversation. We ask for clarity, and that those watching this, wherever they hold, will walk away just encouraged and challenged to think more deeply about this event we know you care deeply about. And we're grateful for this opportunity, and we pray it's in your name. Amen.
Amen.
All right, hard stop would be 12 my time, but I don't think we'll go that long. I'm thinking 75, 80 minutes at most, as I sent to both of you, but absolute latest, depending on where they're at, because I got to teach, and I know you guys are busy given enough time. So that would be the absolute hard stop, no matter what on that end. So, all right, let's let's rock and roll. This is going to be fun. Let me get this going. Hit start here. All right, here we go. What is the evidence for the Exodus? Dating early or dating late? What does Scripture say about this? What is the evidence outside of Scripture? And where should Christians land when thinking about this vital event in the Old Testament? Well, we have two scholars today who I am, to say absolutely thrilled to have on is an understatement, because I've followed both of their works. We've got an archaeologist named Dr. Titus Kennedy. I believe this is the third time you've been on the show. Tom, Archaeology of Jesus, the Old Testament, the Exodus. You've taken a 15th century dating, which we'll discuss. And then David Falk, first time to the show, but I have been watching your stuff online. He takes a 13th century dating, is an Egyptologist. So we've got two eminently trained thinkers. First time they've interacted. Gentlemen, thanks for coming on and being willing to talk about this.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's great to be here. I'm looking forward to an engaging and informative conversation, hopefully for everybody.
I think it will be. Yeah, for sure. So let's start with the biblical evidence, where we land. And Titus, you take a 15th century view. Maybe walk through biblically how you land there. And of course, David, I want your feedback and thoughts after that.
Sure.
Sure. Yeah, so I would start with the standard passage in 1 Kings 6:1 that places the exit from Egypt in the 480th year, connecting to the time of Solomon's temple being built. So it's 479 years have elapsed. It's now the 480th year. So I would read that as a real number and calculate back from the time of Solomon's reign and the establishment of the temple. So we're looking at about 967 BC for the beginning of the temple, and going back to about 1446 BC, plus or minus there for that. Now, one of the reasons why I would take that as an actual number is because I think that it's indicating what we might call the Exodus era. So in Numbers 33, 38, they're still in the wilderness. They're near the end, and it talks about the 40th year after leaving Egypt. So I think that helps to establish a marker for how this might be written and communicating an actual sequence of years, sort of like era names that were given in other periods of ancient history. But not relying only on that, I would also look at Judges 11:26, where it's the time of Jephthah, and we are told that it's been about 300 years since the Israelites settled or showed up in the area of Canaan. Now, we don't know exactly when Jephthah was dated to, maybe 1100 BC. He's certainly a little bit before Saul, right? And Saul comes in about 1050 BC. So you add 300 years, you add 40 years for the wandering, you're getting pretty close again to 1440 BC for the Exodus. And then I would also look at 1 Chronicles 6:33 to 37, where we have a total of about 19 generations between the Exodus and Solomon, maybe 18 full generations and a half generation on each side, something like that. Now, this doesn't give us an exact figure of time, right? So we have to look at what were generations in the ancient world, and a variety of studies have put it somewhere between 22 to 28 years for a generation. If we looked at the midpoint, about 25 years times 19, that's 475 years, very close. We drop it a little bit lower, it might be closer to the 440th year, the Septuagint variant of the 1 Kings 6:1. Or, maybe it's slightly above and we're going slightly over 480 years. But that would be my basic take from the Old Testament. I might also point out that in the book of Acts, Luke also assigns 450 years to this large period of time that goes from about the Exodus to Samuel.
Okay, so you're talking a New Testament passage, 3 different Old Testament passages, Judges, 1 Samuel, I believe you said, or Chronicles, and 1 Kings. Those numbers taken straight forward would converge on the 15th century. David, your thoughts?
Well, my thoughts are that I have concerns with all the particular readings of those passages. In the case of 1 Kings 6:1, I'd like to ask Titus, does he take the census numbers of numbers 1, 2, and 25 literally?
I do, except that I would take Eleph as chief or mighty warrior.
Wait, hold it. That's an interpretation. How did you arrive there? How'd you get there?
Well, it's not an interpretation; it's a translation.
Well, wait. But it also has hundreds and fifties.
Yes, so I would take the hundreds and fifties as hundreds and fifties.
You take those as hundreds and fifties, but the others as the Aleph as sort of tribes?
As chief or mighty warrior.
Okay. How did you arrive at that interpretation?
Because if we extrapolated, it looks like we froze for a second. If we extrapolated 600,000 plus fighting men, then we would get a population of Israelites anywhere between, say, 2 to 3 or so million.
Mm-hmm.
And that just seems way too big for the population of Egypt during the New Kingdom or Canaan during the Late Bronze Age. It doesn't seem to fit. And I mean, this is a whole other discussion.
Okay, no. This is actually on point. This is actually on point. Because what you've done here is you've taken an external piece of evidence to inform your interpretation. I think that's appropriate. That's a good thing to do. You should do that. When I read 1 Kings 6:1, I'm reading it contextually. 1 Kings 6:1 is a temple dedication inscription that was recorded in the Book of Kings. I'm comparing it to other temple dedication inscriptions, which have not necessarily precise numbers. In fact, they're idealized. So my warrant for reading that 480 years as an idiomatic number is based upon other texts. One just cannot say, hey, it's a precise number, I take it as a real number. That's not an argument. You need a warrant even for, say, a literal interpretation, such as what you've just presented here. Now, that's my issue with 1 Kings 6:1. When we go on to, say, Judges 11, I don't think that Jephthah is a reliable witness. So when he talks about, his speech to the king, or his letter to the king of Ammon, it has several factual errors in it. Like, for example, in Judges 11:24, he gets the name of the god of the Ammonites wrong. It should be Milcom, not Chemosh. He also gets the theological underpinning of that wrong, where he says, Chemosh gave you your land, as opposed to Yahweh giving land to the believer and the unbeliever alike. He also gets in the very next verse the history of Israel wrong, where it asks, does Balaam, son of Zippor, king of Moab, did he contend against Israel? Did he ever go to battle against them? It's a rhetorical question. The expected answer is no. But the factual answer is yes. He did go to war against Israel and lost. And then finally, that passage in verse 26 where it talks about the 300 years. Well, we're kind of neglectful of that verse, and we don't even read to the end. And it asks the question, why didn't you attempt to reclaim the lands that Israel had captured? Well, what do you think that they were doing in Judges chapter 10? Judges chapter 10 is about the Ammonites trying to seize the land back from the Israelites. So Jephthah here is not a reliable witness. He's not a reliable witness in the slightest. Then we move on to, say, 1 Chronicles 6, 33 to 38. In this particular case, we're not even dealing with an absolute genealogy here. These people aren't related. Okay? Now, first of all, you got a problem with your count. Your count's all wrong. Because the supposed 19 generations, the genealogy actually has 18. Starting from Korah to Haman. Korah is assumed to be contemporary with Moses, and every generation after Korah is a generation that grew up from the Exodus to the conquest. But that's not the case. Exodus chapter 6 tells us that the clans of Korah were Asaph and Asir. That means 4 generations after Korah were alive during the time of the Exodus. So you got to cut off 5 generations right there, just because of the narrative in Exodus 6. Furthermore, the last 8 generations, the generations from Zuph to Haman, they're a copy of 1 Samuel chapter 1, verse 1. And it's taken from the genealogy of Samuel. The problem here is that Samuel is an Ephraimite. He's not a Levite. This is a spliced genealogy. You have the genealogy beginning as a Levite's, and then it's spliced with Samuel's genealogy. This is like an honorary degree. This is to give the posterity of Samuel the fictitious pedigree so his descendants can still serve in the temple as singers. It's not a real genealogy. And because it's not a real genealogy, you cannot use it for chronological purposes. It's an honorary genealogy. And then finally, the Acts where you talk about the 450 years. That's going all the way back into Sinai. We're not even talking about what was the absolute length of, say, the sojourn. The sojourn is less than 350 years. Again, according to the genealogy of Moses in Exodus chapter 6. So, you can't just say, Numbers 33:48 is 40 years and say, oh, because of that, you can interpret all these as, say, the 480 years. Because again, this 40 years is an idiom. We see it in Canaanite literature. We see it in ancient Near Eastern literature, like the Moabite stone, where the king of Moab ascribes Omri a 40-year reign, where the biblical testimony tells us it was only 12. It's a common idiom. This is what we also find, say, throughout the Judges. After every judge, there's 40 years apiece, or at least many of them. It's not exactly 40 years. It's an idiom for an extended long period of time.
Let's go back to 1 Kings 6. This is really helpful. I think we're coming at one of the distinctions is whether these are literal chronological numbers or the word you've used is idiom. in 1 Kings chapter 6, why should we take that more as a historical actual 480 years, Titus? And then we'll move to the Jephthah passage and beyond.
So can you give examples of temple dedication texts that you're comparing this one in 1 Kings 6:1 to as an interpretive?
Sure, I'll give you 2 of them. The temple dedication inscription to Culti-Ninurta I, and the 400-year stela inscription of Seti I and Ramses II.
Okay, and why aren't those using correct numbers?
Well, in the case of the temple of to Culti-Ninurta I, the Temple of Ishtar, it's off by about 20 years. It's a formulation of 60 times 12, 60 being the sexagesimal number of perfection, because of the base of the way the Mesopotamians did mathematics. Now, in the case of the 400-year stela, we know that because we've excavated that particular temple. That temple has been excavated. So we know how old that temple is. And it is 80 years off. It's 80 years too old, but even if you ascribe that to, say, a Hyksos king, well, then it's 50 years too late. So either way, you're off.
Okay, so you're saying one's off by 20 years and one's off by about 50 years, which
50 to 80, depending on which way you're going, but yeah.
Very good. But if you look at the Tukulti-Ninurta text, I mean, we're going back and we're looking at the original building, supposedly 720 years before, and we've got all this mess of, are you going with the middle chronology or the short chronology, etc.? So we may not be right. 700
well,
years.
The middle chronology is a fiction anyway. I mean, if we get right down to it, the middle chronology is a fiction.
Hold on, David. Let him lay out his case.
It's not half of the time. It's not 350 years, 360 years, 400 years even. And for the 400-year stela, I guess that how you interpret it, but in Bitock's reports, it seems like he's putting the Temple of Seth around 1680 or 1700 BC. So if we're going from Seti, talking about 400 years of Seth worship, that seems very close to 400 years there too. Again, maybe it's not exactly right, but 350 years versus 400 years is much different than 200.
Well,
so if we're
idioms are just, I mean, here's the thing with an idiom. It doesn't matter if it's exact or not. I mean, look, if we talk about the Moabite stone, that's like 75% off. I mean, that's a huge gap from 12 to 40, if you want to go there.
But that's a different genre, and that's in the 9th century BC. These other
it's the
two
same
texts
idiom.
From the late Bronze.
It's the same idiom.
So we're talking about Moabites in the Iron Age. It's
still the same idiom, though. I mean, we're seeing this idiom throughout the Old Testament. This is not isolated to just, say, 1 Kings 6:1. We see this in Judges. We see this in other parts of the Exodus narrative. Like, for example, the breakdown of the age of Moses in 3 convenient groups of 40. Coincidence? Yeah. I don't think so.
40 can be theologically significant and also a real number, though.
Oh, it's theological significant, but a real number.
It can be, right? It can be both. It doesn't have to be mutually exclusive.
Well, it doesn't have to be mutually exclusive, but it's one heck of a coincidence, don't you think?
Yeah, sure, it's interesting, but
so after the first 6 judges where we have 40 years of rest, that's a theological and accurate?
We froze for a second, sorry.
Oh, we got you back. Keep going.
Okay. Yeah, I'd like to make a comment on the Judges 11:26 also.
Okay.
So it's not the
Can we hold just can I just a second before we get to the Judges? I just want to make sure we've at least clarified the difference on 1 Kings. So it sounds like you take it as a straightforward number, Titus, but there might be some variance. It might be 450, might be 490. it's somewhat of an estimate, but meant to be close to a real number. David, you think it's an idiom, and it could be in principle 4,000 or 40 years.
Mm-hmm.
So that's really the difference how we're interpreting this passage.
Now,
Is that at least a fair summary?
Is he actually saying that it is plus or minus several years? Is he saying it's an approximate? I mean, Kennedy, are you saying it's an approximate, or are you saying it's exact?
No, I'm not saying it's an approximate. I'm saying that at least the intention of it would be to get it correct.
Okay, so you're saying that the 480 years is absolutely, literally correct?
Yeah.
Okay.
479 years. Yeah, that would be my take, if that's the correct variant. We've got the Septuagint also in there.
Okay, so I think we've highlighted. Okay, keep going.
Back to the Judges 11:26. So the Ammonites are not being addressed there. It's the Amorites. It's two totally different people. The Amorites were not local. They came in and swept in and conquered key places. You can read it earlier in chapter 11. Sihon, king of the Amorites. So the Ammonite god is, as you pointed out, Milcom. That's correct. And the Moabite chief god would be Chemosh. The Amorites, when they went in and took over places, they kept the chief gods of those cities or regions, like Hammurabi keeping Marduk in Babylon, or Zimri-Lim keeping Dagon in Mari. So it's not odd that they would retain those local gods. And it is in the territory of Moab that they're having this conversation. So I don't think that Jephthah is necessarily a bad source of information there.
Wait, hold it. There's some factual issues here. It says that the letter was sent to the king of Ammon, not the king of the Amorites.
It says in verse 19, Israel sent messengers to Sihon, king of the Amorites, king of Heshbon, and Israel said to him, "Let us pass through your land into our place."
Right, that is the recounting of that's the historical prologue of the letter, not who it was addressed to.
Messengers were sent to the king of the Amorites? That's not who it's addressed to?
Let's see here.
The Amorites keeps appearing in this passage, not the Ammonites.
Judges 11. Okay, verse 15. Verse 14, Jephthah sent messengers again to the kings of the son of Ammon.
Yeah, but then you go down and you see that he's talking to the Amorites.
Yes, he's talking, he's giving you this historical prologue. Have you read the passage?
Yeah, Amorites keeps appearing in the context of verse 20.
The Amorites had taken away. That's the whole dispute of the passage, is that the sons of Ammon are contesting that the Amorites took over the land originally. They're making an ancestral claim. The text this is not addressed to the Amorites. It's addressed to the Ammonites. That's what this entire thing is about.
Is that
where all right, we'll move on. I'm not going to agree with that. So.
Okay, fair enough. So at least we've highlighted that this passage in Judges, there's a factual dispute of whether we can trust the story of Jephthah and the dating or not is a factor that would play into this. Fair enough. I'll let our viewers go to the text and make their own decision here. Good enough. I kind of want to move to the extra biblical, but did we miss anything? There was still one passage left over. I believe you said in First Chronicles, when David, you said First Chronicles when it comes to the genealogy that's listed. That was one of the original passages that you mentioned there. Titus, you want to weigh in on this one or move to the extra biblical?
No. I mean, I know there's people that take his understanding of that, and there's others who look at it as a viable genealogy that's giving people, and we're able to trace it back. So there's no use to back and forth. So I understand what he's saying, sure. And there's many people that agree with him.
Okay, fair enough. Any thoughts on the New Testament passage, or we can shift to some of the passage in Luke, I believe it was. or keep moving
It's
forward?
an axe. It's it's a confusing and debated passage. We've got textual variants in there. I wouldn't use that as a crux of the argument. My point is just it looks like a longer period of time when he's talking about that.
Okay. I think we can leave it there. At least my goal is to highlight where we differ and why on the dating. Titus, can I ask you one question just for clarification? When it
Mm-hmm.
comes to like the patriarchs,
Yes.
are all those numbers meant to be taken straightforward as well, or do you allow for some idioms or variants in the larger Pentateuch?
I would take the numbers as they're stated when they're talking about people's ages or how many years they were in a certain place and so forth. So that would be my working methodology, unless there's something really obvious that I think we can't do that with.
Okay. Obviously, we could debate that, but our goal here is clarity, so that
Mhm.
helps us see kind of what's at stake. Super helpful, gentlemen. Let's shift from the biblical to the extra biblical. And I think what might be helpful is we talk about ancient Near East and Egyptian parallels. Titus, maybe walk through a couple parallels that you think are significant to when we would date. In fact, let's actually start with the Pharaoh as I think about it. That might be an interesting parallel, and then we can move to other ones. Why do you think the parallel, why do you think Pharaoh best parallels of the Exodus 15th century, Titus?
I would actually prefer that David get to go here because
Okay.
this is really for him a big part of his argument, I think, connecting to Ramses. So let him kick that off and explain to us more why he takes the 13th century BC view and connecting to that.
Sure.
Okay.
Well, where I start is with the Bible, and that the Israelites settled in the land of Goshen, which it also identifies as the land of Ramses. Now, the land of Ramses is identified in Egyptian texts as the area surrounding the city of Avaris. So that's Goshen. Archaeologically, we find a constant occupation of a Semitic site there at Avaris from the Second Intermediate Period all the way through to mid-Dynasty 19. So that would be that mid-Dynasty 19, which is the reign of Ramses II, is our after which date for the Exodus. So, which is, with the exception of Ramses, is roughly 1288. Then we have the Merneptah Stela, which identifies the Israelites being in Canaan. That dates to the 5th regnal year of Merneptah, so around 1217. We can then narrow this down with the death of Ramses II's firstborn, which happens in his 25th regnal year. So the Exodus is approximately 1265 BC, roughly again the 25th year of Ramses II. Roughly 40 years later, we have the Israelites entering into the land of Canaan. We have the destruction at Jericho. There's 2 destruction layers there. You have Kathleen Kenyon's 1550 BC date, followed by constant occupation, and then Garstang's middle building, late bronze destruction. At Hatzor, you've got 2 destruction layers. You've got a 1500 destruction layer, middle bronze 2B, followed by constant occupation, and then a destruction in the late bronze. If we are to again contend that these 2 destructions happen in one lifetime, i.e. the lifetime of Joshua, there's only one set of layers that match, which is the late bronze 2 destruction layers. And that's, again, in the late 13th century. You also have the altar site at Mount Ebal, which is undoubtedly a late bronze, early Iron Age occupation site, and then followed by an explosion of Israelite settlements in the late 13th, early 12th century. And basically everyone across the board agrees these are Israelite settlements, including Bill Deaver, Israel Finkelstein, minimalists, maximalists alike. They all agree these are Israelite sites. So if you take that together, you have to then come to the conclusion that the king of the Exodus was Ramses II.
Okay, biblical and extra biblical case. Titus, your thoughts or questions for David?
What would you say about Genesis 47:11, where it talks about the land of Ramses? Why do you think that name is used there? If the context that would be much earlier than the time of Ramses II.
Oh, that's easy because it was a retrojection. It's a retrojection back in time. So the book of Genesis was put to pen during the wandering in the wilderness, just like Exodus was, just like Numbers was, just like Deuteronomy was. But it's using the terms of the day. We also find the term Pharaoh in the book of Genesis. And there's no doubt that that's a term that didn't exist prior to Tutmosis III. So that's a retrojective term also. We've got lots of retrojective terms in the book of Genesis. The land of Ramses is just one more retrojective term.
So what would you say, though, to those who would argue that Ramses in Exodus is scribal updating, like we see in a variety of other places in the Old Testament?
I think it is conceivable. It's possible. I don't think it is plausible. Because the reason why is because we have a lot of 19th dynasty toponyms in the book of Exodus. We have to also understand, too, that these toponyms are specific to Dynasty 19. They're either places that were built during the reigns of Seti I or Ramses II, renamed during the reigns of Seti I or Ramses II, or extant during the reigns of Seti I or Ramses II. How much updating do you want to do to the text? That's going to be a critical issue.
I'm not necessarily in that camp. I just see that it's done other places in the Old Testament where often it's quite clear where they've done it. Okay. I don't know if they've done it.
Curious then, if you're not in that camp, why did you bring up the objection?
Oh, I simply wanted to know what if you looked at that in the same way in the Genesis passage.
No, I don't see. Look at that like that. I don't believe in redaction criticism.
Okay. All right. Yeah. Thanks for clarifying. I would probably be similar take on that, and at least on that concept. So, in terms of the Ramses name, I might ask, why does it have to be associated with Ramses II specifically? Now, I know that you laid out your reasons that revolve around the historical and archaeological material that would position it in that. But aside from that, what might you say about the name Ramses in the text of Exodus being associated with Ramses II?
Well, that's because we have it attested extra-biblically. In Papyrus Anastasi 3, where it names P. Ramses, it uses the full titulary of Ramses II. P. Usur Ma'a Re Setepen Re Ramses Meriamun. Okay, it's just laid out there. There's no question that the city of Ramses is identified with Ramses II. And we can go there archaeologically too, because the site of Ramses has been surveyed with ground penetrating radar and cesium magnetometry to show that the earliest foundations were basically a royal residence of Seti I, and then Ramses turns it into a capital city.
Mm-hmm. Isn't in Anastasi 3 also, though, they attribute the founding of the city to Ra?
No.
Really? I recall reading that. Of course, it's a legendary type of thing. We see that in other places like Babylon with Marduk and Tyre with Melkart. Now, what about, we don't have the P component in front of Ramses there, like we do with Pithom, or like we do with the name of the Egyptian city. Could that not be significant?
No, because we do find it in other places where, even in Egyptian texts, it is done. I mean, even in Papyrus Anastasi 3, It calls the city of Ramses without the P. So
And why
so
couldn't that?
so
Oh,
the
sorry.
fact
Go
so
ahead.
the fact is that the P is not significant. The P is just not
Why
significant.
couldn't? So why couldn't that name have been in existence earlier? Because we do have the name Ramses, at least for personal names, appearing back in the 16th century BC, for example. So
We
it's not like it
do?
was a new name in the 19th dynasty.
Oh, it's a very new name. It begins with Ramses the First. Ronca's
Really?
personamen. Yeah, oh sure, absolutely. You don't find it prior to that.
Ramos, son of Amos the first, and Ramos, father of Senanut.
Oh, Ramos. Oh, that's different. What does Ramos mean?
Doesn't it mean born of Ra?
Yes. What does Ramses mean?
Oh, we froze again. Sorry.
What does
We got you
Ramses
back.
mean?
Born of Ra.
No, it doesn't. It does not mean that. Ramses means Ra begotten him. It's got a pronoun in it that you don't find in Ramosa. It's very distinct. This is why we have two S's in Ramses and one S in Ramosa. And the Bible preserves that second S.
Hmm.
That
All right.
second
So
S
your
does
your argument is
that pronoun does not appear in the name Ramses until the 13th dynasty. It does not
for the
appear in
13th.
any civil or personal documents prior to that time. And you can go to Ronca to look that up.
Okay, we'll do that. All right. So that would be your chronological placement, your general reasons then. Uh, Sean, would this be a good time for me to put forth what I think would be the Pharaoh, the Exodus, and some of the basic reasons for that?
Yeah, I think that's a great idea.
Okay, sure. So if it occurred in the 15th century, and we discussed the reasons for that viewpoint, then I believe it would fall into the reign of Amenhotep II. Now, in the Bible, of course, it doesn't name the Exodus Pharaoh anywhere, right? It doesn't name it anywhere in the Old Testament, doesn't name him anywhere in the New Testament, just gives his title. But we do have one ancient text that does give us a clue about this, and this is Manetho, who was an Egyptian priest historian living in the 4th and 3rd century BC, and we only have fragments of what he wrote, but he does talk about a sort of Hebrew exodus, an Israelite sort of departure from Egypt, and the pharaoh that he names associated with that is Amenephis or Amenhotep. Now he doesn't specify which one of those, so we can't say 100% he's attributing it to this, but there aren't too many Amenhoteps. So what about Amenhotep II might I look at and see, okay, there look like there's some circumstantial connections here, or maybe there's some requirements of the biblical text. So first of all, I would go to the story, the narrative in Exodus, and you see how Moses kills the Egyptian, and then he flees into the wilderness, and it says that he's there for 40 years, and then God tells him that the Pharaoh, the man seeking your life, has died. You can go back now. So he goes back, and then this is when he starts having the conversations with the relatively new Pharaoh. Now, if we took that 40 years as the actual 40 years, and I'm aware that not everyone is going to do that, they might take it idiomatically, but if we took it as 40 years, then that disqualifies a lot of pharaohs for this pre-Exodus pharaoh. Maybe we call him a pharaoh of the enslavement. Thutmose III had a reign length of about 54 years, so that would be sufficient. There aren't many others like that. Ramses II certainly had a long enough reign, but if he's the Exodus pharaoh, he's not also the pre-Exodus or enslavement pharaoh, and his predecessor, Seti I, did not reign for 40 or more years. If we're looking at the pharaoh having recently come in power, well, the 1446 BC date for the Exodus. Amenhotep II has come in power recently. Now, I'm looking at the high chronology of Egypt. I know David might prefer the low chronology, although it sounds like with Ramses II and Merneptah, you've tweaked that chronology slightly. You got your own view maybe there a little bit. I noticed it's slightly different by a few years. Anyhow, he comes into power fairly recently. All right, so that general part of the story connects. Now, what about the reign of Amenhotep II might we look at and say, here's some other circumstantial correlations. First of all, we have, we froze again. First of all, we have the abandonment of the Avaris Palace complex during the reign of Amenhotep II. That might indicate that there was something serious that happened during that time. The excavators don't have a specific explanation. They suggested maybe the possibility of some kind of plague. We've got the abandonment of a candidate for Pithom, Tel Retaba, during the reign of Amenhotep II. Again, maybe indicative of some upheaval in the country. Amenhotep II on the Memphis and Amada Stele talks about this campaign into Canaan, which is basically a slave raid. He claims that he takes back over 100,000 of these people from Canaan. Maybe he is trying to repopulate his slave supply, or at least tell people like he saved face, he retrieved them, or he replenished them. In his text, he's very, very braggadocious. Now, other pharaohs were, of course, too, but you can see maybe the stubborn and proud nature of this Exodus pharaoh there. We might also look at something like the Western Karnak stele of Amenhotep II, which has got this strange order where he says that all the images of the gods, and specifically naming Amun-Ra, to be destroyed. He seems angry at these images or at the gods themselves for doing something. Well, if they've completely failed in protecting Egypt during the Exodus plagues, I can understand that. Atenism starts popping up not too long after his time, which, all right, maybe that connected more to economics, I don't know, but there could be some kind of religious upheaval that spurs that movement. And then we have Amenhotep II destroying or usurping Hatshepsut and some of her cartouches. And so he seems to have an issue with her. What did she do to offend the gods or the order of Egypt? Some have suggested that she was the princess or the daughter of Pharaoh who rescued Moses from the Nile in Exodus chapter 2 and raised him. And so she would have this negative association with someone who caused all these problems on Egypt. So that, from an Egyptian perspective, that would be, or from a Pharaoh of the Exodus perspective, that would be some of the main things that I would bring up. I don't want to talk about the wandering or the conquest here, because I think we're going to discuss that a little bit more in depth later.
Your thoughts, David? Thanks for laying that out, Titus.
Well, there's a lot there. My first concern is the snuck premise, which he sort of alludes to a little later on, but his dependence upon a high chronology that has been disproven now for over 30 years. And I think that's a really serious problem. I think this is a really, really serious problem. Because when we look at, say, the reign of Buriash II of Babylon, Assyriologists are in complete agreement that his reign was from 1359 to 1333. He sends two Amarna letters, one to Amenhotep III, one to King Tut. This pegs the accession date of Amenhotep III to 1389, which means the accession of Amenhotep II has to have been in 1425. So you can either have the 1446 date, or you can have Amenhotep II as king of the Exodus, but you can't have both, essentially. Holding both at the same time is impossible. Second, Manetho. Comes down to which Manetho. There's 4 versions of Manetho, each of which name a different king of the Exodus. The one you quoted, Josephus's version, names Amenhotep II, and I'll give you that one's Amenhotep II. But then we got Eusebius's version that claims Akhenaten as king of the Exodus. You got Africanus's version that lists Ahmose I as king of the Exodus. And then you have Theophilus Theophilus' version of Manetho that names Tutmosis IV as king of the Exodus. 4 different versions. Which one's the correct one? Well, given that Manetho is a 3rd century BC Egyptian priest, chances are likely that none of them are the original. That this priest, Ptolemaic priest, wouldn't have cared, and this is the editorial glossing of later Christian and Jewish writers. And this is just basic lower text criticism here. This is nothing extraordinary. Also, your use of the 40-year criteria for Amenhotep II's predecessor, I think lacks biblical warrant. You're using Exodus 4:19 to say that, hey, Moses, go back, the Pharaoh is dead. But that's not what the text says. The text says that all the men that wanted your life are dead. Men, plural. Because of that phrasing, the Pharaoh, predecessor of the Exodus Pharaoh, did not have to be the last man standing. It could have been a powerful vizier, a general, a powerful courtier. It could have been all sorts of other people. The text does not say Pharaoh here, and that's really, really important. And it uses the plural of man. So it is true that many people wanted Moses dead, not just one. Your citing of the abandonment of the palace at Avaris is not actually indicative of a greater abandonment. Now, this is not actually relevant to your argument. And the reason why it's not relevant to your argument is because Egyptians lived in the palace. Who cares if Egyptians abandon the palace? The fact is we have constant occupation during that time in the Semitic district. So we have evidence that shows that the Semitic population was still there all the way through the reign of Amenhotep II. This is an exodus of Semitic people, Amoritic Semites, not of Egyptians. The latest reports from Tel el-Rodaba from the Polish concession have indicated that the abandonment of Pithom during the mid-Dynasty 18 was probably dated to around Tutmosis III, Queen Hatshepsut, and it was of the Egyptian settlement there. It isn't reoccupied by Semites until the building done by Ramses II. Your use of the stela of the slave raid is really post hoc rationalization. There's nothing here that connects it to the Exodus in any way. Slave raids are done. Yes, he probably exaggerated the numbers. So what? His bragging. There's not a single thing that Amenhotep II claimed that was sort of out of the ordinary for an Egyptian king. Really wasn't. It was perfectly consistent with his time and his particular role as king. Your citation of the Western Karnak stele were images of the gods were destroyed. Now, there's nothing in the text that says that he did this out of anger. He just said that the images were destroyed. The king had the prerogative to destroy the images of temples. We've seen this before. Amenhotep III destroys all the images at Luxor Temple, including the temple itself. He raises the whole thing to the ground just to move it 90 degrees so it faced Karnak. The reason why a king could destroy an image or a temple was to build a new greater one. Not uncommon. This happened in ancient Egypt. Again, your use of appeal to Akhenaten here, that, well, turmoil might happen that allowed that. Well, maybe. But you're talking here 50 plus years after Amenhotep II. There's two long, stable reigns between Amenhotep II and Akhenaten. So that's straining the gnat. That really is straining the gnat. And then, finally, Amenhotep II usurping the cartouches of Hatshepsut. Well, kings did this all the time. This is one of the reasons why Ramses II carves his cartouches so deep, so people couldn't do this. Because he did this. He usurped other people's cartouches. Everybody did. You take a beautiful piece of monument like a Middle Kingdom beautiful Sphinx, drag it to Karnak Temple, you carve your own cartouche over top of it. And if you can't carve over top of it, you carve beside it. So this is common in Egypt. There's nothing significant here that would point to. So I think that my overall concern here with your identification of Amenhotep II as king of the Exodus is that not only is it an impossible position, it also lacks the biblical and evidential warrant to make the claim.
That was a helpful response to a lot of the points. We probably can't go through each of these, but maybe 2 or 3 would be helpful if you'd respond back, Titus, in particular the chronology that he started his critique with.
Sure. So I know that the low chronology is more popular now, although there have been some radiocarbon studies recently done that maybe suggest it's a little bit higher than the low chronology. I don't have a huge problem with using the low chronology or something close to that if it's really shown definitively, but there's still a lot of argument. However, as we talked about earlier in the 1 Kings 6:1 passage, there's also this variant of the 440th year. If that ended up being correct, then that chronological shift wouldn't really have an effect. We would still be falling into the reign of Amenhotep II. So until there's some more definitive material on the chronology, I'm leaving that as more of an open question. Other stuff, again, with the abandonment of places like Avaris and Retaba, I'm not saying that I'm not looking for a complete abandonment of every city and saying that's reflective of the Exodus. I'm looking for upheaval in the country, and specifically maybe something targeted at the pharaoh that caused the reaction. Now, there haven't been enough excavations at Tel El Daba to really tell us what's going on with the Semitic town, so to speak, during the rest of the 18th dynasty. We just have more clarity on the palace. The Temple of Seth might have remained in use. It's still unknown. Retaba, the recent report that I have that I read the article on, they're putting it in Amenhotep II's reign. But again, this is not, the crux of the issue. He brought up various other points there, which I think are valid arguments to make. I'm not saying that any one of the points that I make is, again, the crux of an argument. I'm looking at circumstantial things that may connect to it, that seem to connect to it. We've got a different interpretation of how to look at the text of the Bible and some of those numbers. I mean, Exodus 2:23 does say that the king of Egypt has died. So that's what I'm getting the part from when God's starting to address Moses. I know that later in chapter 7, he says all the men seeking your life are dead. Yes. But it was the earlier passage that I'm looking at in terms of the Pharaoh specifically there. So I understand your objections, and the main one I think that needs to be dealt with is the high chronology, the low chronology, something in between, and we really need to figure out, exactly what the years are at some point.
So if I understand correctly, and then jump in here, David, your point, David, was that Assyriologists are in agreement on this higher chronology. Titus, you're saying when it comes to the archaeological record, it is not as settled as people think that it is, more of an open question. And if that variant on 480 years is 440 years, then Amenhotep II would fall within the case that you're making anyways.
Well,
is that fair?
Correct.
Go ahead, David.
Well, even if you do grant the 440 of the Septuagint, and with the low chronology, that would put the Titus's Exodus date at 1416. Okay, so there's going to be some issues even there, because his circumstantial case starts falling apart at that point too, because that slave raid is in the 9th year of Amenhotep II. So there's going to be some issues there.
Yeah, absolutely. That one you pointed out would have to be tossed out. I agree with that. The others, they're not as specific to the very beginning of the reign. But again, I prefer the higher chronology there.
But I think there's an overriding issue here, is that Titus is making a holistic argument. He's making a holistic argument, which is that you gather a whole bunch of various items, and then you say that taken all together, the sum of the items is greater than each individual item. And I think that's problematic from an evidentiary level. An argument is only as good as its premises. If the premises all fall apart, the holistic argument has to fall apart also.
Well, what about your premise of the temple dedication genre being ambiguous numbers? I mean, that falls apart when we looked at the specifics of it.
No, it didn't.
But I wouldn't throw out your entire argument.
No, it didn't fall apart. What are you talking about?
720 years exactly, almost, and almost 400 years exactly.
It's not 400 years almost exactly. It's off by 50 to 80 years, plus or minus 50 years. That's not an exact number. That makes it an idiom.
Okay, so both of you are making holistic arguments, I think, just from different points and for different reasons. Where we differ is on the strength of the particulars that make up the case.
I'm making an inductive argument.
Clarify why.
Okay. Here's the thing. When you make an inductive argument, you take all the evidence, including the counterfactuals. Okay. Everything has to be thrown in an inductive argument. So you weigh the good and the bad. What's in your favor? What isn't in your favor? You have to take a broad approach. You just can't cherry pick the data. You can't just take confirmation bias here and then say, hey, it works. That's the problem with holistic arguments, is they do tend to veer towards confirmation bias. Picking what proves your case, but what doesn't prove your case is ignored. An inductive argument, you have to include the counterfactuals too.
Let's get back to the archaeology of some of these cities, specifically Avaris and Ramses. And David, can you reiterate just some of the basics of the archaeology at Ramses, Kontir, Tel El Daba that you see as correlating with Ramses II in Exodus?
Okay. Tel El Daba is the city of Avaris. It was begun in the 11th dynasty. It was conquered by Akhmos I at the beginning of Dynasty 18, at which point it became, it was still a Semitic city right up through until mid-Dynasty 19. Early in Dynasty 19, the city of Pi-Ramses was begun on the site of Kontir. These are two sites that are separated by 2 kilometers. Once the city of Avaris was abandoned mid-Dynasty 19, the port called Peru Nefer remained in operation until roughly Dynasty 20, in which case both the port and the city of Pi-Ramses were abandoned. So that's it in a nutshell.
All right. So Tel El-Daba was actually founded in the 12th dynasty, not the 11th.
Well,
But my main
it's in the
question,
11th. Yeah, it was founded in the 11th. But go on.
not according to Betok and his team's reports.
We have an agrarian settlement there in the 11th dynasty. But go on.
So my main question was connecting to the not just the establishment of the city, but what do you see as some kind of abandonment or exodus connected evidence in the archaeology of Kontir?
Of Kontir?
Yeah, of P. Ramses, yes.
P. Ramses was abandoned at the end of Dynasty 20 when
Okay.
the capital was moved to Tanis.
Yes. All right. Sorry. Then I misunderstood because I thought you were saying something about an abandonment there during the reign of Ramses II.
That was Tel El-Daba. That was Avaris that was abandoned.
What's the evidence of it being abandoned
It
at
was
that
turned
time?
into a cemetery. The city was turned into a cemetery for P. Ramses. So essentially, it was the whole site was turned into a cemetery except the port.
So you're saying that those 19th dynasty Asiatic burials there, that's the abandonment of Avaris?
I'm saying that the 19th dynasty Asiatic burials, and I don't know what you mean by 19th dynasty Asiatic burials, because we have mostly evidence of Egyptian burials in the 19th dynasty. The Asiatic
Really?
burials are 18th dynasty.
Well, we have those sheep and goat and 2 dog and 2 bull burials that are 18th dynasty, but the 19th dynasty ones I'm referring to are things like those slipper mask ceramic sarcophagi like we see in southwest Canaan, also infant jar burials, and then instances where the
Well,
deceased is
here's the
holding a
thing.
scarab
Here's the
in their
thing.
hand.
There,
So
you're not getting full.
Hang on, David. Let him finish.
Sorry.
sorry, those are the Asiatic Canaanite type burials in the
Mm-hmm.
19th dynasty there that I was
But they're not
referring to.
19th dynasty.
Well,
They might
Betok says
they might be early 19th dynasty, but they're not mid 19th dynasty. Because you
all
do
right.
have some overlap between the two cities in the early 19th dynasty during the reign of Seti I. But here's the thing: agricultural leveling has destroyed all the tombs. So what you're saying can't be possible because of the agricultural leveling. We only know that there are Egyptian burials there because we get fragments of Egyptian pottery, fragments of Egyptian sarcophagi, Egyptian burial goods. That's what we find at Ramses mid Dynasty 19, or sorry, at Avaris.
Okay.
So your
I'm
complete burials have to be before that mid Dynasty abandonment. They have to be before, if they are, say, a complete Semitic burial. Because agricultural leveling has even demolished most of the Palace of Horemheb. And he's definitely Dynasty 18.
Mm-hmm. Right. There's certainly difficulties with the archaeology there because of all that and the amount of material that's recovered.
Titus, maybe lay out for me some of these cities. Ramses, you said Heliopolis, Pithom, if I said it correctly.
Mm-hmm.
What problems you think this potentially raises for a 13th century dating, and or why you think it points towards a 15th century dating? What's your conclusions about the archaeology on these sites?
I don't actually see any necessary problem with the archaeology of those sites for the 13th century. Nothing that would disqualify it, so to speak, because it's not as if the text tells us that these cities were completely abandoned or they weren't or something happened. We just know the Israelites lived there and then they left, and they weren't the only people living there. There were Egyptians there, there were other Semites there. So we're not just going to get a completely gone total city type of a thing. So I wouldn't say that I'd pick anything out at the 13th century because it's got habitation there. both, Ramses and this candidate for Pithom does. I would just say that the 15th century has some viable evidence too, and we already talked about the evidence at Avaris for the 18th dynasty, habitation there, and then of course the abandonment of the palace in Amenhotep II's time, and I mentioned Rataba also, which is a candidate for Pithom. Heliopolis I only brought up because it appears in the Septuagint of Exodus 111, and so maybe it's preserving the original writing, that text. It's a variant, we don't know for sure, but Heliopolis is an interesting case. We do have a lot of public building or state building projects done there during the time of Thutmose III, who I would suggest is this pre-Exodus pharaoh, this enslavement pharaoh. And so, I don't know if Israelites built there at that time or not, because we don't have any Egyptian text that tells us that. It doesn't ever specify Israelites built this thing. They didn't get to that level of talking about tribes, but it does connect. It's not contradicting the idea that there's building being done at these cities during this pre-15th century Exodus time.
Okay, so one question, then jump in here, David. On your chronology, Titus, the Israelites in Ramesses, Pithom, potentially Heliopolis, how does that fit into the biblical chronology of a 15th century Exodus? How does it help with a larger case?
Well, we have, for example, at Avaris, we have a large influx of people from the Western Levant, the Asiatics, Semites, come in there and they settle in. Looks like we froze again. Sorry,
you're good. I've got you here.
So people from the Levant come in and they settle into Avaris in the 17th century BC or even 18th century BC, really, and it starts to multiply, right? Okay, so there's this settlement of people that just fits the general idea. Jacob and his family came in there too. Then we have in early dynasty 18, we have the building of all these massive storage silos and storage complexes over the ruins of the former Hyksos citadel. And I would say that sounds a whole lot like the building of storage cities or storage facilities at Ramses and Pithom that we've got in Exodus. At Rataba, they've got also early dynasty 18 large silos that are built. And then again, at Heliopolis, as I said, there's some state building projects that are done there during the time of Thutmose III. So I think the building and specific types of building that's going on fits in this 15th century Exodus. And so, some kind of repercussions. Why are some of these places getting abandoned around the time of Amenhotep II? Did something significant happen in the country to trigger that?
Okay, gotcha. David, jump in.
Okay, well, as far as the abandonment of Avaris, it's not just that sporadic people just abandoned it. It was 50,000 people en masse. That's a lot of people to just pick up and leave. Okay? So this is not a small abandonment. This is a big abandonment at the end of Dynasty 19. Now, as far as the storage city is concerned, we have to biblically go back to Exodus 1:11, where it says that the Israelites built storage cities, Pithom and Ramses. Okay? Now, Heliopolis is added in the Septuagint. We can't be sure of Heliopolis. The site's still going under excavation, and it's been around since the 3rd dynasty all the way up to the Ptolemaic period. So, that's a long-lived site. The problem here is going to be the storage cities. The storage cities are essentially storage magazines that were used around temples. And they're massive. They're really massive. You can go to the Ramesseum today and see these storage cities. And they're huge. They cover acres and acres and acres. So they're big. Okay, and they're there to provide offerings for the temple. To store offerings for the temple, because they didn't have cash back then. The problem here is not going to be so much even, say, the city of Ramses, even though Ramses is a name that we can date. But Pithom's going to be a real problem. And the reason why is because those storage magazines have to be associated with a temple. The temple at Pithom was built by Ramses II, and it's this is the temple of Atum, where we get the name Pithom from. P Atum, House of Atum. So this is sort of the date mark for Pithom. It's not called Pithom prior to Ramses II, but it's because Ramses II built a Ketem fortress there, a temple of Atum, and storage magazines to feed the temple. This is going to be an issue when it comes to the dating of Exodus 1:11. Because you can't just say this is just a rename, because there's an actual activity attached to it, an action where the Israelites are said to have done these works for the king.
All right. We're getting close on time. I mean, I have little remarks that I might say, but maybe we can look at some of the things in Canaan and the conquest before we run out of time, because I haven't really gotten to say anything about that yet.
Okay, let's do that. That sounds good.
Sure. So David brought up his view early on, as he's attributing some 13th century BC destruction, like at Hatzor, and then he mentioned something at Jericho first. I'll start with Hatzor. Certainly, there is that 13th century destruction at Hatzor. There's that late Bronze 2B destruction that targeted several aspects of the city, including gates and temples and the palace. And, there's mutilation of statues, and I would certainly attribute that to the Israelites. It's, conventionally dated around 1210 BC, something like that. So it's pretty close to where he's saying Merneptah comes in and attacks the Israelites right when they arrive in Canaan. But I would say that is Judges 4 and 5 with Deborah and Barak, the second kind of destruction in this Joshua Judges era. Earlier, we have in Stratum 15 in the Acropolis and Stratum 2 in the lower city, we have another late Bronze 1 fire destruction of the entire city, including, of course, all the gates, the temples, the palace or ceremonial palace, however you interpret that. And I would say that massive fire destruction then is attributed to the Joshua conquest there at the end of late Bronze 1. Now, Jericho, of course, there's lots of debates over Jericho in terms of the chronology. Kathleen Kenyon's reports, although I disagree with some of her things, she did a lot to help, I think, clarify the manner of destruction of that city. And she talks about there's a walled city, and then the city walls of mud brick fall down, and they actually fell down in front of the stone retaining wall. And it sort of forms this ramp that you could walk up into the city. But subsequent to that, the attackers burned the entire city, including all these massive jars full of grain, that rather than attack before harvest or looting it, they just decided to destroy it. It's kind of weird, but all that stuff matches up with the manner of destruction in Joshua. So really the major issue is, do you take her 1550 BC date, or do you take the later Italian-Palestinian excavations 1500 BC terminal date at the end of MB3, or do you take Garstang's date at the end of LB1 for 1400 BC? And I would go with Garstang's LB1 and 1400 BC because of mainly some of the pottery and the scarabs. Mainly some of the pottery and the scarabs. So we've got chocolate on white ware, for instance, which newer studies of this show it's an LB1, about 1500 to 1400 primarily type of pottery. But there's also Cypriot bichrome, which Kenyon claimed that she didn't find this stuff, but she just took her conclusions and didn't actually publish her excavation reports. They didn't come out until after her death. You can look through them now. There's a lot of examples of Cypriot and imitation ware. So there, and then the scarabs, right? There's nearly a continuous sequence of scarabs that are found there until Amenhotep III. He's the latest one, and I would say he is the pharaoh in power during the conquest. And chronologically, it lines up, 40 years after the Exodus, 40 years after Amenhotep's things that we discussed earlier. We also find an Amenhotep III scarab in a destruction layer at Jericho and Gezer and so forth. But to the comments about the middle building, that's not a city. It's a residence. It's a large building. It's not a walled city, so that doesn't fit with Jericho. And it was only there in the 14th century in LB2A, and then abandoned. So I think it's really difficult to connect that to the fall of Jericho's walls and the fire destruction over the city. That that would kind of be in a nutshell what we're talking about with some of the conquest.
So simply put, you got an Exodus about 1446. They wander 40 years. Early 1400s is then when you have the conquest you did with Garstang, supported by some of the archaeological pieces that you laid out. David, your thoughts?
Okay, let's start with Hatzor. He really only brings up one point about Hatzor, which is the destruction Stratum 2. Really, it is at the end of Stratum 3, the beginning of Stratum 2. So it's not really considered part of Stratum 2, it's considered part of Stratum 3. And all the archaeological reports for Hatzor state this. So essentially
no, that's not true. Not excavated there. You're wrong on this.
Well, Hesse seems to disagree with you then. And so does Yadin.
No, Yadin's reports say that, and so do the renewed
She's quoting Yadin here in his 1975 article. Or is his book. He's basically saying Stratum 3. Stratum 3 to Stratum 2 is where the destruction layer is taking place. You may have excavated there, but you obviously haven't read the reports.
Stratum 2, as you just said.
Mm-hmm.
Stratum 2, as you just said. And
I said Stratum 3 to Stratum 2.
Well, he talks about destruction.
That destruction layer is at the end of a stratum. That destruction layer is at the end of the Middle Bronze 2B period. You don't begin a period with a destruction. You end a period with a destruction. That's why the destruction layer is attached to Stratum 3, not the beginning of Stratum 2. This is basic archaeology. Okay. Let's move on. Let's move on to Jericho here.
Don't teach me about archaeology, man. I've excavated way more than you in directed projects.
Okay. Doesn't mean you can read a research report. Okay, next.
All right, let's move on to Jericho.
Okay, let's go on to Jericho. Now, the most recent reports are by Lorenzo Nigro of the Israel-Palestinian expedition. Now, what he attributes here to the walls falling down and creating that sort of enrisement there is actually has been now determined to be a ramp for battering rams. Okay, so those are not the walls falling outward. That is an attempt by some invader to build a ramp for a battering ram. Okay, and that comes directly out of Lorenzo Nigro's 2020 report. Second of all, the presence of the bichromeware indicating of Late Bronze 1, we now know that is part of a constant occupation at Jericho that began in Late Bronze 1 and continued all the way through to the end of Late Bronze 2A. We have, and while he sort of dismisses the middle building, we also know that the entire periphery of the site had a mud brick Late Bronze wall. We also have essentially a cuneiform tablet there that dates to Late Bronze 1, which indicates that there was at least a palatial or administrative center there. And the reason why we don't find more extensive ruins there in the Late Bronze was because the whole site was leveled for rebuilding during the early Iron Age, Roman and Byzantine periods. And we can even find evidence of this in the Bible. 1 Kings 6:1 says that, sorry, not 6:1, 1 Kings 16:34, I believe. Hiel the Bethelite basically lays out the foundation, levels the foundation of Jericho to rebuild upon it. So we even see this in the Bible. It's there in the Bible. As far as there being no walled city in Late Bronze 2A, that's pretty much old news. That's old reports. The latest reports basically say that there was constant occupation there. And frankly, this explains the presence of the scarabs. This explains the presence of the bichrome ware, at least and the occupation of the city there until, including the cemeteries. You can't have a late bronze town without a late bronze cemetery without a late bronze town. Okay, doesn't make sense to just bury your dead in the middle of nowhere. Okay. So we've got here a constant occupation from Late Bronze 1 to at least the end of Late Bronze 2A. And Late Bronze 2B, those layers have been removed by site leveling. And this is all in the latest report by Lorenzo Nigro.
Titus, your thoughts?
The Helani building built above the middle building, yeah, that's certainly an Iron Age structure there. But the main Roman and Byzantine settlement, especially Roman settlement, was not built at Tell Sultan. It was elsewhere. The entire late Bronze Age didn't just disappear from the site. You know, if it was there, froze again. If it was there, it didn't just all disappear from the site. That's not a phenomenon we see. Part of the site did get bulldozed, but we have continuous stratigraphic layers that we can look at. So we both stated our positions on that. I would dispute or not agree with some of the things you said, but thank you for clarifying that.
All right, let me jump in here for sake of time. We got a few minutes left. I'm going to have each of you in a minute just kind of give any final thoughts, position you didn't put forward, maybe an argument you didn't respond to. But I'm curious, and either of you can comment on this. Is this disagreement here one that's newer throughout the church? Has there been a range of different views that have been debated? What's the historical sense of this debate? Are one of you in the mainstream? That's what I'm trying to get at, historically speaking. I know that's not exactly your lane, but either of you jump in here. David, what's your sense historically of how Christians and Jews have approached this?
Okay, well, it really wasn't an issue until the mid-19th dynasty, or sorry, not 19th century,
19th
AD.
Century, yeah.
19th century AD. During the 19th century AD, we find this huge debate going on, and you can even look this up in the newspaper articles. The first time, say, the late Exodus view was proposed was around 1850 by C.R. Lepsius. And it became the predominant sort of theory in Jewish and Christian circles until 1906, when James Orr said, hey, the Ramses view is the traditional view, but I've got this new view, which basically takes the 1 Kings 6:1 and correlates it to Amenhotep II. So that's where the early date of the Exodus, the modern version of the early date of the Exodus begins, is in 1906.
That makes sense. With biblical criticism, with archaeology growing around that time, it would become more of a debate. That's super helpful. All right, for sake of time, I'd love to hear. Let me ask you this, Titus. One more, and then I'll give you your final thoughts. Where do you see debates or discussions on this headed? What work still needs to be done?
That we're going to continue along. I think we're going to continue along in the same discussion. Because textually, I don't think people are going to come to an agreement. It's an issue of your foundational hermeneutics. So really, it's going to be what continues to be found archaeologically, and does it look like it's supporting or contradicting one or the other view, or maybe even something in between. And I think that eventually we'll come up with a really clear answer. And so I really hope that we continue finding material that clarifies this for everybody.
That's great. All right, let's get just some final thoughts. If there's a point that you want to make, Dr. Falk, maybe a response you didn't give out there, or a piece that advances the 13th century Exodus. Final thoughts on this conversation.
My thoughts are that the more evidence we have, the better. And take it all. Good, bad, the ugly. My belief is that we have to hold to the importance of Scripture, take Scripture seriously. It's an important historical source. I believe in a historical exodus. I think there's good evidence for a historical exodus. And I think that our reading of the Bible has to be in concord with history itself. And I think this is a matter of inerrancy. that to be consistent is a biblical inerrantist, I also have to be consistent as a historian as well.
Okay, very helpful. Dr. Kennedy, final thoughts on this discussion?
Oh, I think it was really an informative and helpful discussion. And I think that for everybody watching it, they're going to learn a lot more about two, variants of what might be two of the main views, and hopefully educate themselves and maybe figure out, which they think is more plausible, or wait until some additional evidence comes in.
Dr. Falk, how can people follow you? I think you have a YouTube channel. Tell us the best way to track your work.
The best way to track my work is on my YouTube channel, Ancient Egypt and the Bible. We do Q&A live streams every Friday night. If people want to ask me questions directly, we take those questions. We also do a Monday educational release. We won't be doing it today because of this, but didn't have time. But priorities, you got to pick them. So that's how people can reach me, is through my YouTube channel.
Thanks for carving out the time to do this. I know it was a sacrifice. Dr. Kennedy, how can people track what you're doing?
Well, I don't have my own channel, but I occasionally appear on various other ones if people are interested in seeing lectures or interviews or discussions. And you can take my class at Biola, or you can join me for a dig sometime. So I'll leave it up to you.
That's awesome. Well, speaking of Biola, those of you watching, make sure you hit subscribe. We've got some other conversations like this, diving into important topics like the Exodus, cultural issues. If you've thought about getting a master's degree in archaeology, is one topic we discover and discuss in apologetics. We have a fully distanced, top-rated program. Information is below. We would love to help train and equip you in your endeavor to defend the faith. And I'll make sure you hit subscribe here as well. So the two of you, can't thank you enough. I was hoping to keep this to about an hour and change, but we got way too much. Not too much. I actually want to keep going forever, but got to respect your time.
Hey, I'm happy to do it again.
Well, let's look at doing it down the road again. Really appreciate that. And thanks to both of you for taking the time to come on.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Thank you for hosting, Sean. Thank you for joining the discussion and all the information, David.
It was my pleasure. It was great meeting you too.
You too.
All right. You guys are good. We got it. Got a great recording. Don't worry about those freezing things. I'll slightly edit that out. That was minor.
Yeah. Sorry. I don't know why that happened, but
no worries at all. That's small. I think this is super helpful. I think it's next week. I'll send you guys the link and you can use it big or small, however you want to. I'll probably cut some small clips and use it. But this was super interesting. I learned a ton and appreciate it. Thanks to both of you.
Well, thank you very much for having me.
Yeah.
All right,
thank
guys.
you, Sean.
Yeah.
All right.
We'll
take
do
care.
It again with both of you. Thanks.
Have a great day. See ya.
Bye-bye.
You got it. Make sure I got this.